The forgotten enormous hovercraft. Big hovercraft was the pride of Britain 50 years ago. They were a new kind of machine that could go almost anywhere, on land, water, or almost any other surface. And they were fast, able to go as fast as 133 kilometers per hour. The largest one could carry as many people as a jumbo jet and 60 cars at once. These big companies once said they would change the way we travel. But almost none of them are left today. Think about how hovercraft is different from other vehicles to see why they were such a big deal. In fact, they are more like airplanes than they are like boats. This is because hovercraft can basically fly. Lift and thrust are the two main ideas behind how they work. Fans trap a cushion of air to help the plane take off and stay in the air, and propellers push the plane forward. All of this means that friction and water resistance are much lower. This means that a hovercraft can go much faster than any ship. But being fast isn't the only good thing. Because no other vehicle can do as many things as a hovercraft. They can go where no other vehicle can, like out to sea, in shallow water, on ice, or through a swamp. Where there is no harbor, a ship would run aground, a hovercraft can just crawl out of the water. The idea of hovercraft was very smart. And in the 1960s, it seemed like a revolution in transportation was just around the corner. When the first hovercraft came out in the summer of 1959, it shocked everyone because it seemed to float over any surface as if by magic. Christopher Cockerell, a brilliant British engineer, wasn't the first person to think of a hovercraft. But modern hovercraft wouldn't be possible without the momentum curtain, which was Cockerell's most important idea. In the past, people tried to make hovercraft by blowing air into an open hull. This didn't work very well and took a lot of energy. Cockerell came up with the idea of directing a ring of air toward the edges of the hull to trap high-pressure air. So the craft could stay in the air much higher above the ground. In 1959, Cockerell and two other people were the first people to drive a hovercraft across the English Channel. But the hovercraft couldn't reach its full potential until another important idea came along. In 1961, another British engineer suggested adding a flexible skirt to the craft. This would let it hover much higher off the ground and handle uneven surfaces better. Hovercraft could become much more useful if their skirts were more flexible. And it made British plane makers rush to come up with their own designs. Almost overnight, Britain saw the first small-scale hovercraft transportation services pop up. In just a few short years, hovercraft would go from small prototypes to huge boats that could carry hundreds of people. By the middle of the 1960s, hovercraft were all the rage everywhere. And countries like the US and France put a lot of money into their growth. But the British were in the lead, and Saunders Roe was the best company in the world. They had not only built Cockerell's original prototype, but also a number of civilian and military designs. And in 1963, Saunders Roe set out to make a new kind of hovercraft. One that is 4 times bigger than what has been made before and is built to compete with regular ferries. A ferry took about an hour and a half to cross the English Channel. With a hovercraft, the trip would take only half an hour, so twice as many people could cross each day. The name of the new big hovercraft would be SR.N4. It would work more like an airliner, with a captain, flight engineer, and navigator, as well as a deck crew of 11 and a cabin crew of 11. In its standard form, it could hold 30 cars and 254 people, or it could be changed to hold 609 people. No one had ever tried to make such a big hovercraft before. There were huge engineering and economic risks. In the summer of 1968, the world's largest hovercraft began service between Britain and France on the English Channel. Princess Margaret and Christopher Cockerell were among the famous people who were on the ship. As the 165-ton machine picked up speed, passengers were amazed at what the British had done. But what no one knew yet was that the rubber skirt of the SR.N4 was literally ripping apart under them. Attachments that were meant to bend with the waves were broken or torn off by rough seas, so repair crews had to work hard to replace them after almost every trip. And after only 3 days of use, a big wave damaged the boat, taking it out of service for almost a week. And that was just the start of things going wrong. Because of mechanical problems like hydraulic and gearbox failures, crossings were often called off. But the weather was even more important. The SR-N4 was made to handle waves that were only 2.5 meters high. And it didn't take much to make those kinds of conditions in the English Channel. In the first 3 months it was open, more than a third of the trips that were supposed to happen didn't happen. The first show didn't go well. And in October 1968, the SR-N4 was taken out of service for good so that it could be changed a lot. Large passenger hovercraft was not reliable and didn't seem like they would be good for travel on open water. Even though the first one was a disaster, cross-channel hovercraft became a huge hit with travelers. When the SR-N4 was put back into service, many of the problems it had before had been fixed. And the skirt had been changed so that it could handle waves better. By the middle of 1970, there were 2 carriers on the English Channel that ran famous hovercraft. And they couldn't keep up with the demand. Trips were booked up weeks in advance. Still, there was a problem. Neither of the 2 carriers was making money. Because each SR-N4 burned 1,000 gallons of fuel made for airplanes every hour. And compared to regular diesel ferries, the costs of maintenance were out of this world. Both carriers had to make changes to their hovercraft to increase the number of people and vehicles they could carry. This was done by making the hulls wider and longer. By 1978, the biggest hovercraft could hold as many as 418 people and 60 cars. Giant hovercraft became more competitive when their capacity went up. By the end of the decade, nearly a third of all passenger traffic across the channel was done on hovercraft. But as the 1980s got closer, big civilian hovercraft would face a problem that no engineer could solve. The famous hovercraft would still be the fastest way to cross the English Channel if they were still in use today. More quickly than regular diesel ferries or the high-speed catamarans that came out in 1991. Even the Channel Tunnel, which opened in 1994, is not as fast. It wouldn't have made a difference. As a way to get around, the hovercraft was doomed from the start. In the early 1960s, their incredible speed had captured the public's attention. But that speed cost them pretty much everything else. Compared to regular ferries, hovercraft were less reliable, less efficient, less able to handle rough weather, and less comfortable. And that meant that by the end of the 1960s, most people were no longer excited about hovercraft. And Britain's once thriving hovercraft business went into a slump. In the 1970s, fuel prices went through the roof, which made things even worse. Putting the last nail in the coffin and making sure that fuel-intensive hovercraft will never be widely used as a form of transportation. It also meant that the huge SR-N4S would be the best passenger hovercraft ever made. But in the 1980s, they had to deal with more and more competition from regular ferries, which made enough money to keep lowering prices and win back customers. After the Channel Tunnel opened in 1994, it was no longer possible for giant hovercraft to compete. But no other vehicle can do as much as a hovercraft. Because of this, these great machines are still used by the world's military, industry, and rescue services even though the famous SR-N4S were all taken out of service by the year 2000. But many people say that hover technology never got to where it could be. In the 1960s, Cockerill and British engineers had a much bigger idea for a new kind of transportation that would float on a cushion of air and go as fast as 500 kilometers per hour. They were called tracked hovercraft, and even today, they would have been faster than any train. By 1972, engineers had come up with the right technologies and built a test track and a model train. They looked like they were about to change the way trains work. But almost all their work has been forgotten. What are your thoughts on hovercraft? Would you want to ride on one if it still exists today? Like this video and share this to your friends, and consider subscribing to our channel for more. See you in the next one.